while the others speak and observe their fellow panelists. Our first presenter is Ido Kilovaty. Ido is a research scholar in law and a cyber fellow at the Center for Global Legal Challenges and a resident fellow at the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. He, at Yale, is running and developing a cross-disciplinary project on cyber conflict, bringing together lawyers, policymakers, and technology experts, engaging in discourse on the current state of affairs on cybersecurity law. And Ido is going to speak about Doxfare, election hacking as prohibited intervention.
Better now? Yes. All right, so thank you for sticking around for my presentation. I want to talk about the Russian interference in the US presidential election of 2016 from the perspective of international laws, prohibition on non-intervention. As you could tell, this is a highly contested area of international law, and we're constantly being challenged by new and nuanced cyber operations that sort of make it more difficult as we go forward. So this is part of my forthcoming article in the Harvard National Security Journal. And I will start right away with the argument that I'm making in the paper. The argument that I'm making is twofold. So first, the emergence of cyber operations creates a host of possible digital interferences. And that could undermine the protected sovereign functions of the state. While the prohibition on intervention requires a coercive act against a domain reserve in order to reach the threshold of illegality, these cyber operations are rarely coercive and thus not really triggering the norm on non-intervention. And second, the inherent non-coerciveness of cyber interferences leads to adversaries exploiting that very specific gap in international law. And information, when obtained through hacking of non-public systems, becomes a weapon of intervention. And this is part of a phenomenon, as the title of the session suggests, of weaponizing of information, which holds that information becomes more valuable as we go down the road. And the article is really about rethinking non-intervention and rethinking coercion in the era of weaponized information, and sort of providing an alternative approach, an alternative way to think about cyber interference. So I will proceed in three parts in my presentation. So first, I want to talk about the international norm of non-intervention and what it means, very briefly. Second, I want to introduce the Russian doctrine of reflexive control, which was developed back in Soviet era, and how that sort of impacts the landscape of cyber interference. And finally, I want to propose an approach or a way to think about digital election interference, which sort of takes a step back from the traditional coercion framework that we have with non-intervention today. So the focus of the paper is really the principle of non-intervention, or the prohibition on intervention. And it is implicated by the Russian interference in the US election. And for intervention to be wrongful under international law, it must have two constitutive elements. The first one is that the interfering act must target what is called the domain reserve, so it's the core sovereign functions of the state, whether it's internal or external affairs. And the second requirement is that the interfering act must be accompanied by an element of coercion. And while these two elements were reinforced by ICJ decisions in Nicaragua and armed activities, it is still unclear what is the precise interpretation of coercion. And it is sort of ill-defined under international law. But the general idea of coercion is to condemn dictatorial acts which force the victim state to make a decision it otherwise wouldn't. And one informal definition of coercion is an act of state against another state to compel the latter to think or act in a certain way by applying various kinds of pressure, threats, intimidation, or the use of force. So while being a constitutive element of intervention, coercion substantially impedes international law's ability to fully apply to the Russian digital interference in the US 2016 election. And this demonstrates that even a notion that appears intuitive, such as the prohibition on intervention, is being challenged by the new technological landscape and power dynamics. So the Tallinn Manual holds a similar approach to non-intervention, which holds that persuasion, criticism, public diplomacy, propaganda, retribution, and mere maliciousness do not reach the degree of coercion. And therefore, those are outside of the scope of the norm on non-intervention. However, cyber interference is a little bit more nuanced than just spreading propaganda. And as demonstrated in the 2016 election interference, it could include manipulation, hacking, doxing, and much more elements that are sort of in the gray area of international law. So the bottom line is that coercion does not translate very well in that context. And because cyber operations could influence and lead to a desired outcome by the perpetrator in the victim state, they could be non-coercive as well. So the title of the session, again, is The State in an Era of Weaponized Information. And I want just briefly to address the phenomenon of weaponizing of information because I believe that it's changing the way that we should be thinking about that context. There's an important technological shift that's ongoing in the world right now, which is that the relative cost of hardware is decreasing while the value of information is constantly increasing. And this provides an incentive for adversaries to target information rather than the physical infrastructure. And from an international law perspective, this is a real challenge because international law traditionally has to do with physical aspects of state-to-state interactions, not with the digital world and its implications on those relations. So in this paper, I address a phenomenon that I call Doxfare. And Doxfare is derived from the term doxing. And for those of you unfamiliar with the terminology, doxing is basically leaking bulk information with the purpose of malicious intent, and the information is usually either sensitive or personal or otherwise non-public. So the most obvious case of Doxfare that I'm making in the paper is the Russian interference in the US election, because it included a hack of certain systems, of the DNC systems, and John Podesta's email, and probably a bunch of other attempts to hack state election officials, and so on. And in addition to that, we have the dissemination of the exfiltrated information on WikiLeaks and other platforms, and Twitter bots, and a bunch of other operations that sort of spread out that information to the broader public, potentially with the intent of swaying the public opinion in the US and affecting the outcome of the election. So I want to give a little bit of a background. The Kremlin's newfound appreciation for the weaponizing of information can be found in its reliance on reflexive control. Reflexive control is a theory that offers one compelling explanation of digital election interference. It underlies the weaponizing of information phenomenon and should be a powerful consideration for reforming traditional notions on non-intervention and coercion. And although the United States and Russia are not in an official state of war, reflexive control can still explain statecraft by doxing. So reflexive control is the study of an adversarial power to exploit its weak spots, intending to lead the enemy to reach a decision that benefits the controlling state. And reflex refers to the process of imitating the enemy's reasoning or imitating the enemy's possible behavior and causes him to make a decision unfavorable to himself. And the idea here is to study the moral, psychological, and personal factors of the enemy so that these can be part of the deception operations that shape the conceptions of the enemy with somewhat of a disconnect from objective reality. So according to this theory, the side that has the highest degree of reflex will have the best chances of winning. So reflexive control may be achieved by creating an informational reality of a certain kind. So that could include propaganda, leaks, disinformation campaigns, such that the opponent will voluntarily, or seemingly voluntarily, make a decision favoring the state that created this reality. So in that case, that would be Russia creating a control over the US using this informational environment. So the decision made by the controlled actor stems directly from the disinformation communicated to them by the controlling adversary. And it involves specific process of imitating the enemy's reasoning or imitating the enemy's possible behavior and causes him to make a decision, again, unfavorable to himself. So this is becoming a broader phenomenon enabled by the digital era, which allows adversaries to disseminate information that would lead to the desirable outcome. And in the pre-cyber era, this was only achievable sort of in times of war, because only in times of war we had this geographical proximity and these interactions that allowed for this sort of reflexive control between adversaries. But now cyberspace empowers the tenets of the theory of reflexive control because it allows the dissemination of information at scale, doing so across political borders and at low cost, and more or less instantaneously. So the reflexive control theory, although developed by the Soviets in the 60s, it's appearing in literature dating back 30 years. And it appeared in the headlines recently, actually in the non-cyber context, with the war in Ukraine. And in that context, reflexive control was not purely informational on Russia's behalf, but it was reported that Russia concealed and obfuscated its forces, what colloquially we call the little green man. And Russia publicly denied the real reasons that Kremlin engaged with war with Ukraine in the first place, and they shaped the narrative in a way that benefited the Kremlin, primarily by using social media and other online platforms. So these actions allowed the Russian government to create whatever story it wanted for whatever audience it wanted, and thus influence the public opinion that it tried to target. So arguably there is potentially a difference between publishing authentic documents and spreading disinformation or manipulated data, whether in legitimacy or the degree of wrongfulness under international law. So the bottom line here, to conclude that part of reflexive control, is that it allows interference without coercion. And with the emergence of cyberspace operations, this creates a legally exploitable area by adversaries. So my proposed approach to sort of rethink that, in addition to the intent of interference, is really two elements that I want to focus on, putting aside coercion for a second. So the first one is the intrusion, the hack itself, and the second one is the leak, is the doxing part of the operation. So more specifically, I suggest in the article that we should take a step back from the unattainable coercion standard and instead focus on more straightforward two elements, which are hacking, which is one, and leaking of the exfiltrated information, which is element number 2. And this is very much a response to the underlying trend of weaponization of information, which enables states to create this enormous harm simply by exposing sensitive information or by manipulating and disseminating it in modified form for the broader public. So this approach makes it possible to change the narrative of existing international law to address digital election interference, as opposed to creating an entirely new response, an entirely new legal framework to address cyber interference. So changing notions of non-intervention are not unprecedented, because during the 19th century, international law afforded states protection only for their territorial integrity, and not only until the 20th century did the scope of non-intervention expand to protect political independence. And it is entirely possible that the next evolution of non-intervention will incorporate cyber interference as well. So to discuss those two elements more in detail, first, the intruder hacks into the computer system by employing one of the techniques that we usually use to compromise software, network, or hardware. And the techniques range from social engineering, where the hacker attempts to gain access to the system by stealing the credential of an authorized user, to actual hacking, where the hacker identifies the vulnerabilities in a system and exploits them to access that very specific system. So that standard could help in determining the wrongfulness of interference, because it is typically implicating domestic criminal laws, which pertain to unauthorized access to computers. So in a sense, what I'm making here is the internationalization of unauthorized access. The second element, and I'll be very brief, and I'll finish this in less than 2 minutes, hopefully. The second element is the leak or the doxing element that takes place usually after the hacking itself. And in this step, the actor behind the data breach publishes the data, usually in bulk, to a platform that hosts those documents. Recently, it's been WikiLeaks, but it could be other platforms as well. So what I want to really conclude with is that those two elements taken together could form somewhat of a substitute, or at least a beginning of how we should be thinking about coercion in the cyber era. But unfortunately, politically, it might encounter some problems, but I think this is the beginning of the changing notion of coercion in the digital era in the wake of cyber interference. So just to conclude, the article argues that the element of coercion does not provide an adequate standard for intervention in the cyber conflict era. Cyber operations are, and this is very central to my paper, cyber operations are rarely coercive in nature, yet they are still able to interfere in the domain reserve of a state and cause substantial harm. And at present, the coercion requirement is the crux of the difficulty in international law's inability to delegitimize digital election interferences, such as the Russian interference in the US presidential election. And international law should adapt to this by redefining the boundaries of the norm of non-intervention, though this might be, again, somewhat time-consuming and politically difficult in the future. In addition, there are some second-order questions that will require further development, particularly questions on attribution, enforcement, and countermeasures, and so on. And so this gap between coercive and non-coercive is currently providing a space for exploitation for states seeking to avoid international legal responsibility. And in the aftermath of the Russian interference in 2016, many have struggled in utilizing international law to condemn Russia's conduct. The DNC hack was a challenging case for international law, and future acts of cyber interference will potentially reshape how we think about non-intervention and coercion in the cyber era. So that's it for me. I hope I was on time. Thanks.